thank you so much, Lamya, for joining me today to discuss your excellent book. I'm so excited to be discussing such an impressive memoir. So, first of all, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. So I'm going to just quickly do an introduction, then we can get started. So, first of all, Lamya H is a queer Muslim writer and organizer living in New York City. Her memoir, Hijab Butch Blues, was published by Dial Press last month. Lamya's work has appeared in Los Angeles Review of Books, Salon, Vice, Autostraddle, Vox, and lots of other places. She has received fellowships from Lambda Literary, Aspen Words and Queer Arts. Lamya's organizing work centers around creating spaces for LGBTQ plus Muslims, fighting Islamophobia, and abolishing prisons. So very impressive. And I'm really excited for you to be here to talk with me about this excellent debut memoir. So first of all, obviously, I've got to ask, like, what made you feel this was the right time to actually write the memoir?
Oh, honestly, I've been writing for a while. I've been writing sort of like essays, like you talked about. I've had them published in various places, but it was only when I started. I found myself writing the Hajar essay that's in the book that comes towards the end, because I found myself in this situation where me and my partner were going to visit my family, and we were pretending to be friends, and we were pretending that we weren't in a relationship. And it was also Eid, and so the story of Hajar was just sort of like everywhere. The story of Ibrahim, and people were talking about that story because in like sermons and posts and other things. And I found myself really reflecting on my situation, where I felt really happy that I, was able to take my partner to meet my family, and she got to meet, my cousins, my grandma, but then there was also like this deep-rooted sadness, and I found myself thinking a lot of Hajar and how she must have been feeling those things too. And so that's where that first essay came from. And once I found myself writing that essay, I just had this feeling that I had so many more of these essays to write, because I had been thinking about sort of like these dilemmas that I would find myself in. And I had also spent a lot of time sort of thinking about stories of the prophets in the Quran, and just as sort of like complicated figures. And so in some ways, the book sort of like, the book came out of that essay because I had so many more essays and chapters to write. And then I found myself sort of like writing more and more, and then shutdown happened, and I suddenly had sort of like time and space to write, because I had one of the jobs where I just like couldn't work from home. So I was at home and, trying to figure out what to do with my time. And it was just like so lovely to have uninterrupted time during the day to really focus on writing. And that's how the book came about.
Yeah, it seems to be the case with a lot of people, isn't it? The projects they managed to get on with during lockdown, indeed. And so, I'm like, obviously, what I read was that there was a lot of sort of different identities that you were dealing with, and a lot of conflicting messages that you can't be this and you can't be that.
Mm.
So, how did you manage all those different messages?
I It took me a really long time to realize that I didn't have to listen to everyone. I think that was one of the things that I just like really had to learn in my 20s, that you hear all this messaging, but what's really important is figuring out how to sort of like carve your own path. And yeah, and just like, and figuring out how to live in ways that really feel true to you. So to me, I feel like I got so many messages about like how to be queer or how to be Muslim. And to me, it was just like really a matter of sorting through and being like, oh no, this is what I want out of my life. And this is how I want to live.
That makes complete sense. And one thing that really seemed to strike me is that there was a lot of sort of loneliness, I
Mm.
think, throughout your books, like in terms of like wherever you were sort of going from home, then traveling to the US. And, so how did you deal with that? Just this kind of like isolation, essentially.
Mm. Yeah, I think one of the big turning points in my life was when I found community, and which really expanded my notions of sort of interdependence and like being able to be vulnerable around people and letting people in. Um, and that loneliness was such a big part of my life in various ways, like growing up as a brown kid in this sort of like Arab country that I lived in, or even sort of like moving to the US and just like not knowing a lot of people, not really having a ton of family here. And then from that to sort of like, finding myself in sort of like queer spaces as the only sort of visible Muslim, or like finding myself in Muslim spaces as someone who's queer. And to me, finding community of people who were both sort of like queer and like Muslim, or like Muslim-ish, and sort of on the spectrum of those identities, and like had other identities too, and that were just like really living their difference. That was a big turning point for me in my life, and that really changed the way that I think about the ways that we connect with each other, and the ways in which it's possible to build relationships that are, really rooted in an intentional love and an intentional sort of like building, and like not shying away from conflict. A lot of those things like really led me to find community, and that is what finally sort of like lifted some of that deep-rooted loneliness.
That yeah, it definitely feel like as you were going towards towards sort of mid to the sort of last part of the book, you definitely find more people who are just like sort of
Mm-hmm.
really accepting, which it was really beautiful. But I think one thing that really struck, it was just amazing, the juxtaposition, I think, between the teachings and also just your experiences. And I liked the story that you brought up, which is Mariam's story.
Mm.
So do you still think Mariam is potentially homosexual?
A dyke. Yeah, I mean, yes, potentially, but also I think what was really interesting in sort of like looking back at myself in my sort of childhood is that that moment of like of recognizing that she could be made me feel so validated and so like seen, and like not like I was the only person in the world. Um, and yeah, I remember being sort of like 14 and having this moment where I was like, oh wait, Mariam, just told this man who appeared at her door to go away, and she says that she's never been touched by a man. And I don't know, there was just something there that felt so deeply powerful to me. And that's kind of my thing with the other sort of figures in the Quran as well. So I read a lot as a kid, and I still read a lot. And to me, one of my favorite things about reading is being able to really get inside a character's head and be able to sort of like hear almost their internal dialogue, and like just really like deeply know their sort of like dilemmas and their decisions and like their thoughts and why they're making a certain choice, and what are their regrets, and what are the just like what's in their head. And to me, I like grew up with the Quran as like just like a text that was everywhere. It was it was something that people played on the radio, or you'd be sort of like walking down the street and you'd pass a mosque and you'd hear Quran being read. And so to me, as I was reading the Quran, a lot of the same questions would come up for me around the various stories and the various figures, like why, how does Moses feel when he, first talks to God? Like, what must that have been like? Was he scared? Was he anxious? Was he nervous? And yeah, so to me, it felt like I don't know, being able to really like question all of the motivations of these figures and in these stories really led to a lot of self-reflection on my part, because I would also find myself in sort of like tangly situations the way that a lot of the prophets did. And so yeah, it was really helpful to be able to look at my life through the lens of these stories, the same way that, you know, I've been looking at my life through the lens of all these other books that I read.
Yes, no, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about, which is exactly this juxtaposition between the teachings and your experiences. And you know, do you think it helped you made sense of your life and your experiences that you were going through then through the teachings?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Yeah, I mean, like one of the things that I write about, for example, is this idea of Musa, also known as Moses, and the miracles that God gave him. And the story is that God gives him all these miracles and says, "Okay, cool. Now these are yours to use to sort of like prove to people that you're a prophet and that you're going to help all of these people who are being oppressed by the pharaoh at that time." And and I don't know, I've often thought of my queerness as this miracle. It's just like this thing that happened to me. But what was really interesting in sort of like thinking through the miracles that Moses was given was like, did he like, how did he feel about these miracles? What was it like for him? Was there a reluctance? Was there an excitement? Was there what were the things that he was feeling? And it was really interesting to be able to sort of like map his feelings around something like that to my queerness. It to me, writing is an act of sort of like figuring out what's going on. And what'll often happen with me is that there'll be something that's kind of like stuck in my head. And I'm like, why do I keep coming back to this? Why does this give me either sort of like discomfort, or like why is this sticking in my head? And to me, writing is a way of sort of disentangling that and figuring out the various sort of like angles and layers to why I keep coming back to something. And so being able to look at something like my queerness through the lens of Musa and his miracles really like allowed me to explore it for myself. Yeah. So it was really great as a tool for sort of like self-reflection and for really trying to get at the heart of some of the things that have happened to me.
Yeah, I found it really interesting, and you know, having read all those stories and things like that, I could totally see the relation that you know
Mm.
you'd created for yourself, and that was really quite something. And you were talking about, you know, sort of going through really difficult spots, of course, you know, and you're saying that the writing was helping. And so, how did you deal with sort of the hierarchy aspect of being treated differently
Mm.
constantly to other people in whichever like, environment you were in, and obviously even more so in the US. So how did you manage to deal with that?
Honestly, it was really hard and still continues to be hard. One of the frameworks that I use for thinking about sort of like race and hierarchy in the ways that you're talking about is this idea of jinn, who are jinn are these sort of like creatures that exist, like sort of like supernatural creatures. And what it feels like to me is that, I don't know, there's all these parallels between the ways that I'm treated in terms of like hierarchies, and the way that jinn are treated. There's this way in which like my visible Muslimness makes me both like invisible and hypervisible, which is like such a theme in terms of jinns, for example, as well. Like you can't see them, but there's so many sort of stories, and especially growing up, like everyone would love telling jinn stories, and they were supposed to like scare the shit out of you. And so, yeah, so it's really interesting because being able to sort of like think through some of those ways that the hierarchies map onto jinn really helped me think through how they map onto my race and my sort of like visible Muslimness. In terms of dealing with it, man, it is hard. Yeah, it's hard being a queer person in the US right now. It's hard being a visible Muslim in the US. Yeah, it's hard.
It's sad. I'm like, yeah, and I had to ask because it was just like I really hoped, like it felt like by the end there was you know, you found some sort of resolution. But you know, at what point did you feel like you belonged?
Mm. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that I necessarily do. That's a good question. I live in New York, which definitely helps. It is the best city in the world. Just because New York, the thing that I love the most about New York is that there's so many people from everywhere, and everyone is existing in the same public space, and everyone is sort of like using the same subways, like going, you know, like walking down the same streets. And so people are constantly brushing up against each other. And so there's a sort of like nonchalance to difference. And there's this way in which it's possible to explore various aspects of yourself because no one cares. I mean, not to say that there haven't been times when I've, you know, experienced like I've experienced sort of like slurs being thrown at me for looking visibly queer, or I've experienced sort of like people saying terrible things because I'm wearing hijab. But there is something to the city that that makes me feel more like I belong, more than I've lived, more than anywhere else that I've lived.
I'm really glad to hear that because obviously, you know, you do want to find that sense of
Mm.
community and belonging at some point because it can get really hard, I think, to exist. And so, do you think you've been able to find sort of like a space to be your authentic self now in public?
Yeah, and I think what I didn't realize in my 20s was that my sense of authentic self is like constantly evolving. I'm still figuring out who I am. I'm still figuring out how I, you know, want to present to the world. And so, yeah, I think I definitely feel like I have a space in which to explore that sense of evolving self, which I think is also a good thing. I hope to always be someone who's growing, and yeah, so I definitely feel like I've gotten to a point where I feel comfortable doing that.
That's lovely. Like, you know, some of the stories you mentioned about your friends, it just seems so wonderful to have that acceptance from all your various friends from across the pond, you know, to the people that you say, you know, you loved, to the
Mm,
person that is your best friends.
mm,
You know, that just acceptance also from their families, and also from your within your own communities. You know, I think the New York or American
mm,
Muslim community, which was like, yeah, absolutely
mm,
fine. Which is such a wonderful thing to see, that level of like community and belonging. So it was really nice and really heartening to see that there was a place, you know, for you
mm.
there. So yeah, so thanks, Lamia, for chatting to me today. It's such an important conversation. So I really hope that it also you sharing your experience that other also queer people, Muslim
Mm.
people will also find that, oh yes, there is a community for me to belong as well.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Fantastic.